My life was painted in shades of gray. Not the 50 shades of anything interesting, but the flat, unassuming gray of an unprimed canvas, of sidewalk cement after a light rain, of a sky that couldn't decide between sun and storm. It was a life of routine, meticulously curated to avoid disruption. I woke at 7, drank my coffee black while staring at the blank wall opposite my small kitchen table, and then I would retreat to my studio. A generous term for the spare bedroom I'd filled with easels and the sharp, clean scent of turpentine. I painted for 8 hours, broke for a silent lunch, and then painted until the light failed. My evenings were spent with books I barely remembered and meals I hardly tasted. Loneliness was a roommate I had long ago stopped trying to evict. It was quiet, it paid its half of the silence, and it never left dirty dishes in the sink. I was an observer by trade and by nature. I captured the world on canvas, but I never truly felt a part of it. My paintings were vibrant, full of color and life. I felt I was only borrowing, channeling from some other place onto the stretched fabric. They were lies, in a way. Beautiful, elaborate lies that told stories of connection and passion I only understood in the abstract. I was emotionally isolated, a ship in a bottle, intricately built, perfectly preserved, and utterly unreachable. This quiet dissatisfaction was a low hum beneath the floorboards of my existence, a sound I had learned to ignore most of the time. Then the phone rang. It was my sister, Sarah, and her voice had the frantic, effervescent quality it only got when she was about to ask an enormous favor she would frame as a minor inconvenience. "Leo, you will not believe what happened," she started, without so much as a hello. "Julian's landlord is a certifiable monster. Sold the building out from under him, gave him 2 weeks' notice." 2 weeks. Can you imagine? I could, actually. It sounded like something that would happen in the world outside my apartment. I made a noncommittal noise. "The thing is," she barreled on, "he has nowhere to go. Everywhere is insanely expensive, and he needs a place like yesterday. And I was thinking about your spare room." The hum beneath the floorboards grew louder. "My studio. My sanctuary. Sarah, it's not a spare room. It's where I work. I know, but it's huge. You could totally fit a bed in there and still have space to do your paint-y thing. It would just be for a little while. A month or 2, tops. Just until he finds a new place. Please, Leo. He's a great guy. You'd love him. He's clean. He's quiet. He's never home anyway." I doubted all of those things. My quiet was a fragile ecosystem. A new variable, a foreign body, would throw the whole thing into chaos. I pictured another person's coffee mug next to mine, another person's shoes by the door, another person's sound filling the silence that was exclusively mine. My throat felt tight. "I don't know," I said, the words feeling thin and useless. "He's desperate," she whispered, a dramatic shift in tone designed for maximum guilt. "He's my best friend, Leo. I'd have him here, but you know Mark's allergic to everything that breathes. Please." For me, I was a pushover. It was one of my many unpainted flaws. I sighed, the sound of surrender. The gray of my world was about to be invaded by an unknown color. "Fine. A month. Maybe 2-inch. Sarah's squeal of delight was sharp enough to crack glass. I hung up the phone and stared at my studio door, a sudden feeling of dread coiling in my stomach. The catalyst had arrived, not with a bang, but with a phone call. My meticulously constructed bottle was about to be uncorked. He arrived 3 days later, on a Tuesday that had, until that point, been perfectly, predictably gray. I heard the heavy tread of his boots on the stairs before he knocked. I opened the door, and the first thing that hit me was the sheer amount of space he took up. Julian wasn't just tall. He had a presence, an easy, confident energy that seemed to push the very air out of my small entryway. He was all broad shoulders and a lean frame, dressed in a worn denim jacket and dark jeans. His hair was a chaotic mess of dark curls, and his eyes, a startlingly warm shade of brown, held a glint of amusement. "You must be Leo," he said, and his voice was the second thing that hit me. It was low and smooth, with a slightly rough edge, like aged whiskey. It was a voice that could coax secrets from stone. He stuck out a hand, and his grip was firm and warm. "Julian, thanks again for this. You're a lifesaver." "It's no problem," I lied, my own voice sounding reedy and unfamiliar. My hand felt small in his. He held on a fraction of a second too long. his thumb brushing against my knuckles. A jolt, small but distinct, shot up my arm. Then he smiled. It was a slow, easy grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. A mischievous grin. It was the kind of smile that suggested he knew a joke the rest of the world wasn't in on yet. My carefully constructed defenses felt flimsy, like paper walls against a rising tide. He carried 2 duffel bags and a single cardboard box, and as he stepped past me into the apartment, he brought the outside world in with him. The scent of cool autumn air, of leather from his jacket, and something else, a subtle, clean cologne, like sandalwood and something sharp and green. It was a scent that didn't belong in my world of turpentine and dust motes. It was the scent of life. My apartment, my quiet sanctuary, suddenly felt impossibly small. He was a foreign element, a vibrant, unpredictable slash of color on my pale gray canvas, and I had no idea what to do with him. He dropped his bags with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the silence. He looked around, his warm gaze taking in my Spartan living room, the stacks of books, the single, lonely armchair. His eyes lingered for a moment on the closed door to my studio. "So, this is the place," he said, his voice still holding that low, resonant hum. "It's clean." I couldn't tell if it was a compliment or an observation of a sterile, lifeless environment. "I like things tidy," I mumbled, feeling a ridiculous need to defend my empty surfaces. "I can respect that," he said, that grin returning. "I'll try not to mess up your tidiness too much." I had a sinking feeling it was a promise he had no intention of keeping. Not out of malice, but simply because his very existence seemed to be one of casual, charming disruption. I showed him to the studio, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. Pushing the door open felt like a violation. My space, my smells, my light. He stepped inside and whistled softly. Sarah wasn't kidding. "This room is huge." He walked over to my main easel, where a half-finished landscape sat, a swirl of angry violets and brooding blues. He didn't touch it, but he leaned in close, his head tilted. I found myself holding my breath, watching the line of his jaw, the way a stray curl fell across his forehead. I was observing him the way I observed a subject for a portrait, cataloging the details, the play of light and shadow on his face. "This is incredible," he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were serious for the first time. "You're really good." The genuine praise caught me off guard. Most people said things like, "Oh, how nice," or "You're so creative." Julian's words felt different. They felt like he actually saw it, the work and the frustration and the small moments of victory on the canvas. A faint warmth spread through my chest, an unfamiliar sensation. "Thanks," I managed to say. He spent the rest of the evening unpacking his meager belongings, setting up an inflatable mattress in the corner of the studio. I tried to paint, to reclaim my space and my routine, but I couldn't. His presence was a constant, humming distraction. I was aware of every sound he made. The rustle of fabric, the soft thud of a book being placed on the floor, the quiet sigh he let out as he finally lay down. The scent of him, that sandalwood and green, had already begun to seep into the room, mingling with the turpentine. My sanctuary was no longer just mine. The first few weeks were an exercise in protracted observation. I became a student of Julian. From the relative safety of my corner of the apartment, I watched him. I learned the rhythm of his mornings. He was an early riser, up before me, the scent of his coffee a new part of my wake-up ritual. He drank it with a splash of oat milk, leaving the carton on the counter every single time. He had a specific mug, a chipped ceramic one that was a deep forest green. I learned the sound of his footsteps, a confident, even tread that was so different from my own quiet shuffle. He was, as Sarah had promised and I had disbelieved, rarely home. He worked long hours at some vaguely defined tech job, leaving before I had my second cup of coffee and returning late, usually carrying the scent of the city with him, exhaust fumes, street food, the faint perfume of a crowded subway car. But his absence was as loud as his presence. His jacket would be slung over the back of the sofa, a silent testament to his intrusion. A pair of his worn leather boots would be by the door, scuffed and solid. These small signs of him were like breadcrumbs, leading my carefully ordered mind into a state of constant, low-grade awareness. When he was home, I would retreat into myself, pretending to be absorbed in a book or a sketchpad. But I was always watching. I watched him stretch after a long day, his back arching, his shirt riding up to reveal a tantalizing strip of pale skin and the hard line of his hips. I watched his hands as he typed on his laptop, long, capable fingers moving with a quick, fluid grace. I watched the way he'd run a hand through his messy curls when he was concentrating, a gesture of unconscious frustration that I found inexplicably endearing. My internal monologue became a running commentary, a frantic analysis of his every word and action. One morning, as I was pouring my coffee, he walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower, wearing nothing but a pair of low-slung gray sweatpants. The air was thick with the scent of his soap and his skin. "Morning, sunshine," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. He gave me that lazy, one-sided smile and reached around me to grab his green mug from the cupboard. His arm brushed against my back, a fleeting warmth through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. The casual endearment, the careless touch, they sent my mind into a tailspin. Sunshine? Who says that? Was it a joke? Was it just something he said to everyone? Or was it flirting? I spent the next hour replaying the 30-second encounter, dissecting his tone, the look in his eyes, the exact pressure of his arm against my back. I told myself I was being ridiculous. He was just being friendly. He was a friendly person. That was a thing friendly people did. But a small, hopeful part of me, a part one had thought long dead and buried, latched onto the word. Sunshine. It was a color I hadn't used in a long time. He took an interest in my work that felt both invasive and thrilling. He'd come into the studio while I was painting, always careful not to get too close, and just watch. He'd lean against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. I tried to ignore him, to focus on the canvas, on the mix of colors on my palette, but his gaze was a physical weight on my skin. I could feel him watching my hands, my face, my every movement. "What are you thinking about when you choose a color?" he asked once, his voice quiet, careful not to break my concentration too much. I paused, my brush hovering over a patch of canvas. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm not really thinking. I'm feeling. This part of the sky needs to feel lonely. So I use this blue." I pointed with my brush to a mix of cerulean and a touch of black. He was silent for a long moment. "My sky would be a different color," he finally said. "Yeah? What color?" "Orange," he said, a smile in his voice. "Like a sunrise. The opposite of lonely." I risked a glance at him. He was looking at me, not the painting, and the intensity in his gaze made my stomach flutter. I quickly turned back to my work, my hand suddenly unsteady. I was reading too much into it. He was just making conversation. But my brain wouldn't stop. Why orange? Why the opposite of lonely? Was he talking about the painting, or was he talking about me? This constant state of analysis was exhausting. I was a detective in my own life, searching for clues in a case that probably didn't even exist. The touches escalated, always couched in plausible deniability. We were watching a movie on my small sofa one night, a tense thriller that had us both on edge. The sofa was too small for two men, forcing a proximity I was both dreading and craving. Our shoulders were pressed together, our thighs almost touching. I was hyper-aware of the heat radiating from his body, the subtle scent of him that clung to the cushions. During a particularly jarring jump scare, I flinched and his hand shot out, landing on my knee. A simple, reflexive gesture. But he didn't pull it back right away. His fingers rested there, warm and heavy, a grounding presence. My entire nervous system lit up. I couldn't breathe. My gaze flickered down to his hand, the long fingers, the clean, short nails, the dusting of dark hair on his knuckles. He kept it there for a full minute before seeming to realize what he was doing and pulling it away, clearing his throat. "Sorry," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the screen. "It's fine," I whispered, my voice tight. But it wasn't fine. It was catastrophic. It was a 5-alarm fire in the quiet, orderly museum of my life. Another time, I was trying to reach a book on the top shelf of my bookshelf, stretching on my toes. He came up behind me, his chest brushing against my back as he reached over my head and easily plucked the book from the shelf. "Here you go," he said, his voice a low rumble right by my ear. His breath was warm on my neck. I froze, my body rigid, every nerve ending screaming. The space between us was charged, electric. He handed me the book, our fingers brushing, and the contact was like a static shock. He stepped back, putting a respectable distance between us, but the ghost of his touch, the memory of his heat, lingered for hours. I started to crave these moments, these ambiguous interactions that I could turn over and over in my mind. It was a dangerous game. I was living on crumbs of affection that might not even be real. I was painting a fantasy in my head, using the barest outlines of his actions and filling them in with the vibrant colors of my own yearning. He was just a roommate. A kind, handsome, and perhaps overly familiar roommate. That was all. I repeated it to myself like a mantra, a prayer against the hope that was starting to bloom, wild and untended, in the barren landscape of my heart. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less I believed it. Every casual touch felt meaningful. Every lingering look held a question. The tension was a thread being pulled tighter and tighter, and I was terrified of the moment it would finally snap. The snap came in the form of a burst pipe. I was woken one Thursday morning not by the smell of Julian's coffee, but by the sound of a steady, rhythmic dripping. I stumbled out of my bedroom to find a large, ominous water stain spreading across the ceiling of our small hallway, and a puddle forming on the hardwood floor. It was the kind of domestic disaster my quiet life was specifically designed to avoid. Before I could even process the full scope of the problem, Julian was there. He took one look at the situation, said a single, concise curse word, and sprang into action. "Okay," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "You find the main water shutoff. It should be in the basement. I'll start moving stuff and find buckets." There was no room for my usual paralysis. His decisiveness was infectious. I found the valve in the dusty, spiderweb-filled basement and cranked it shut. When I came back upstairs, Julian had already moved the hallway bookshelf and was arranging an assortment of pots and pans under the worst of the drips. He had a focus and a competence that was both impressive and incredibly attractive. We spent the next 4 hours in a flurry of chaotic teamwork. The landlord was, predictably, useless, promising to send a plumber sometime this week, so it was up to us. We laid down every towel I owned, sopping up water that seemed to be coming from everywhere. We moved furniture, our bodies brushing against each other in the cramped space, our hands meeting as we lifted the heavy sofa. There was no time for the awkwardness or the overanalysis that usually defined our interactions. We were just two people fighting a common enemy, water. At one point, I slipped on a wet patch of floor, and he caught me, his hands grabbing my waist, holding me steady. His face was inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. The world seemed to slow down, the frantic dripping fading into the background. All I could feel was the solid pressure of his hands on my body, holding me up, keeping me from falling. "Whoa, careful there," he said, his voice a low murmur. He didn't let go immediately. We stood there for a beat too long, caught in the gravity of the moment. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. I could feel the warmth of his palms through my shirt. Then he seemed to shake himself out of it, helping me regain my balance and letting go, his hands dropping away almost reluctantly. "Thanks," I breathed, my voice shaky. He just nodded, a muscle twitching in his jaw, and turned back to the task at hand. But something had shifted. The barrier between us, already fragile, had been washed away with the dirty water. We were no longer just roommates. We were partners in a small, ridiculous crisis. By early afternoon, the dripping had slowed to a pathetic trickle. We were both soaked, exhausted, and surrounded by a fortress of damp towels and precariously balanced buckets. The apartment was a wreck. "I think that's the best we can do for now," Julian said, sinking onto the floor and leaning his back against the displaced sofa. He ran a wet hand through his already chaotic hair. "I'm starving. Pizza." An hour later, we were sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, a large pepperoni pizza box between us. The shared disaster had morphed into a strange kind of picnic. We ate in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the tearing of cardboard and our own chewing. The frantic energy of the morning had dissipated, leaving behind a quiet intimacy. "You know," Julian said, breaking the silence as he wiped grease from his chin with a napkin. "For a guy who likes things tidy, you handle chaos pretty well." I shrugged, a small smile playing on my lips. I had a good partner. The words were out before I could stop them. They hung in the air between us, simple and true. He looked at me, his expression soft. Yeah, he said quietly. We make a good team. We finished the pizza, and the easy quiet returned. It wasn't the empty, lonely silence I was used to. It was a shared silence, full of the unspoken understanding that comes from tackling a problem together. We had navigated a small storm, and in doing so, we had found a new kind of equilibrium. The formal lines of roommate and landlord had been blurred into something much more complicated and much more real. I felt a wall inside me, one I hadn't even been fully aware of, begin to crumble. Later that night, long after the pizza boxes had been cleared away and a semblance of order restored, I found myself unable to work. The half-finished landscape on my easel felt foreign, its moody purples and blues no longer matching the strange, warm current running through me. I stood in front of it, my brush limp in my hand, my mind a blank slate. The frustration was a familiar ache in my chest. The floorboards creaked behind me. Creative genius at work? Julian's voice was soft, tentative. I didn't turn around. Something like that. I sighed. More like creative block. He came to stand beside me, not too close, but near enough that I could feel his presence, a steady warmth in the cool air of the studio. We both stared at the canvas for a long moment. What's it supposed to be? He asked. I mean, I know it's a landscape, but what's it supposed to feel like? The question was surprisingly insightful. Most people just asked what it was a painting of. It's the feeling of waiting for a storm. I tried to explain, the words feeling clumsy. That heavy, quiet moment right before the sky breaks open. The air gets thick, and everything is holding its breath. That's what I'm trying to get. But it's not right. It just looks muddy. He was quiet, considering my words. I could feel his gaze shift from the painting to me. I don't know anything about art, he said, his voice low and sincere. But I like watching you work. My breath caught in my throat. I turned to look at him, my heart giving a painful lurch. He was looking at me with an unguarded expression, a flicker of something vulnerable in his warm brown eyes. You get this look on your face, he continued, a faint smile touching his lips. Like you're a million miles away, in a world that only you can see. It's intense. He was admitting he watched me. Not just in passing, but really watched me. The way I watched him. The thought sent a dizzying rush of heat through my body. The air in the room suddenly felt as thick and charged as the pre-storm sky I was trying to paint. This was a different kind of breakthrough. It wasn't about a shared crisis. It was about a shared observation. He saw me, in a way I wasn't sure anyone ever had before. I started, but I had no words. My entire vocabulary had abandoned me. He seemed to sense my turmoil. He gave a small, almost shy shrug. Anyway, just thought I'd say, don't be too hard on yourself. The sky will break when it's ready. He squeezed my shoulder, a brief, firm pressure that sent another jolt through my system, and then he was gone, leaving me alone in the studio. But I wasn't alone. The space was filled with the echo of his words, the ghost of his touch, the startling revelation that while I had been observing him, he had been observing me right back. I looked at my painting, at the muddy, frustrated colors. And for the first time all day, I picked up my brush and added a streak of brilliant, hopeful orange to the horizon. The opposite of lonely. A week later, Julian suggested we go out for drinks with some of his friends. My immediate instinct was to say no. My apartment was my bubble. The outside world was a place of unpredictable variables and social anxieties I preferred to avoid. But the memory of his hand on my shoulder, of his quiet confession in the studio, was still fresh. I was tired of the gray. I wanted to see what his world looked like. So, to my own profound surprise, I said yes. The bar was loud and crowded, a sensory assault of chatter, clinking glasses, and music that vibrated through the floor. Julian's friends were a boisterous, easygoing bunch. They welcomed me into their circle with a casual warmth that should have put me at ease, but instead, it just made me feel more like an imposter. I nursed a beer, offered quiet, one-word answers, and felt myself retreating into my usual role of silent observer. Julian, however, wouldn't let me disappear. He stayed close, his arm brushing mine, his shoulder a solid presence at my back. He made a point of including me in conversations, turning to me and saying, "Leo's an amazing artist," or "Leo, what do you think?" It was a small, protective gesture, an anchor in the overwhelming social sea. I was grateful for it, but it also made the knot of anxiety in my stomach tighten. He was showcasing me, and I wasn't sure I was a product worth displaying. About an hour in, one of his friends, a loud guy named Mike, was telling a story about a terrible date he'd been on. He finished the story with a dismissive wave of his hand and said, "I don't know. Man, she was being weird. Probably one of those, you know." He made a limp wrist gesture, and a few of the guys chuckled. It wasn't a malicious comment. It was casual, unthinking, the kind of stupid joke I'd heard a million times. But it landed like a punch to the gut. My whole body went rigid. I felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up my neck. I instinctively braced myself for Julian to laugh along, to slap Mike on the back, to join in the easy camaraderie of casual homophobia. It was the expected response, the normal response. But Julian didn't laugh. I watched his profile out of the corner of my eye. His easy smile vanished. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He went very still for a moment, and the air around us seemed to cool. Then, without looking at Mike, he smoothly changed the subject. "Hey, did anyone see the game last night? That last play was insane. It was so subtle, most people wouldn't have noticed. But I noticed." He had shut it down. He had heard the comment, seen my reaction, and deliberately, quietly, deflected it. He had protected me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had chosen my comfort over the easy flow of conversation with his friends. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything but what Julian had done. The tipping point had been reached. The tension that had been humming between us for weeks had been amplified into a deafening roar. This was no longer about a lingering touch or an ambiguous compliment. This was about something real. The walk home was quiet. The noisy energy of the bar had been replaced by the cool, damp air of the city at night. Streetlights cast long, distorted shadows on the pavement. I was acutely aware of the space between us, a gulf of unspoken words. I kept replaying the moment in the bar, his subtle defense of me. I wanted to thank him, but I didn't know how. The words felt too big, too revealing. As we were turning onto our street, Julian finally broke the silence. His voice was low, cutting through the quiet hum of the city. "Did that bother you?" My heart skipped a beat. The question was direct, unavoidable. It wasn't about the joke. It was about me. It was a test. He was asking me to show him a part of myself I kept hidden away, locked behind layers of gray paint and solitude. I could have lied. I could have shrugged and said, "It was a stupid joke, whatever." It would have been the easy way out, the safe response. But looking at his face in the dim glow of the streetlights, his expression serious and searching, I found I couldn't. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It did." He just nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "my friends are idiots." He just accepted my answer. He accepted my truth. And in that quiet moment of acceptance, I felt more seen than I had in my entire life. Back at the apartment, the atmosphere was thick enough to chew. The air crackled with everything that hadn't been said on the walk home. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, my hands trembling slightly. Julian followed me, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. He was watching me again, with that same intense, unreadable expression from the studio. "You're hard to read. You know that?" he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. The subtext was a deafening scream. He wasn't talking about my personality. He was talking about us, about the space between us, about the touches and the glances and the weeks of unspoken tension. He was asking me to give him something, a sign, a clue. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I am standing in my kitchen, and this man, this beautiful, kind, disruptive man, is peeling back my layers with nothing but his gaze. My throat was dry. I took a sip of water, the cool liquid doing nothing to quench the fire in my chest. I couldn't form a coherent response. All my carefully constructed words, all my internal monologues, failed me. All I could do was meet his eyes, hoping my own could convey the chaotic storm of fear and hope and desperate yearning that was raging inside me. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, locked in a silent conversation that was more honest than anything we had ever said out loud. The space between us was a live wire. I could feel the pull, the magnetic force drawing us closer. I wanted to close the distance, to step into his space, to find out if this feeling was real. But I was frozen, trapped by a lifetime of caution. Finally, he pushed himself off the counter. A flicker of something, disappointment, frustration, crossed his face before he masked it. "Well," he said, his voice losing some of its intensity. "Get some sleep." He turned and walked towards the studio, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He paused at the door, his back to me. "For the record," he said, without turning around, "Mike's an idiot, and I'm glad you came out tonight." And then he was gone, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone in the kitchen, reeling. The wire had been stretched to its breaking point. The loaded interaction was over, but nothing was resolved. If anything, the tension was now a sharp, painful ache. I went to my room, the glass of water forgotten on the counter, and lay in the dark, my mind racing. The quiet of my apartment felt different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, breathless quiet before the storm. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was about to break. Sleep was a distant country I couldn't find the passport for. I tossed and turned, the silence of my room amplifying the frantic beat of my own heart. Outside, the world seemed to be holding its breath with me. Then, the first low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The storm I had been painting, the storm I had been feeling, was finally here. The rain started as a soft patter against the window pane, then grew into a steady, percussive drumming. A flash of lightning illuminated my room in a stark, ghostly white, followed a few seconds later by a crack of thunder that shook the old building to its foundations. I flinched, pulling the covers tighter around me. I was so lost in the storm, both outside and in, that I almost didn't hear the soft knock on my bedroom door. It was so quiet I thought I might have imagined it. Then it came again, a gentle, hesitant tap. My heart leaped into my throat. It could only be one person. I sat up, my mouth suddenly dry. "Yeah." My voice was a croak. The door opened a crack, and Julian's silhouette filled the space. The dim light from the hallway backlit his frame, obscuring his expression. "Sorry," he whispered. "Did I wake you?" "No. I was awake." He slipped into the room, closing the door behind him and plunging us into near total darkness, save for the intermittent flashes of lightning. He stood by the door, and I could feel his uncertainty from across the room. He looked uncharacteristically vulnerable, stripped of his usual easy confidence. "Can't sleep," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Storms," he let out a short, self-deprecating laugh that held no humor. "Stupid, I know. I've hated them since I was a kid." Another crash of thunder, closer this time, punctuated his sentence. I saw his shoulders tense in the brief flash of light. It was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of a vulnerability I never would have expected. This confident, capable man was afraid of a thunderstorm. The thought was so human, so endearing, it made my chest ache. "It's okay," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He was silent for a long moment. I could hear the sound of his breathing, a little too quick, a little too shallow. "Look, this is going to sound crazy," he started, his voice strained. "But could I just stay in here? I don't have to get in the bed. I can just, I don't know, sit on the floor or something. It's just being alone during these things." His voice trailed off. My mind was screaming, "Get in the bed, get in the bed, get in the bed." But my mouth formed a much more sensible, much more cowardly sentence. "Yeah, of course. The floor is fine." I heard him let out a breath, a shaky sigh of relief. He moved through the darkness and settled on the floor near the foot of my bed, his back against the wall. The room was filled with a new kind of tension. It wasn't the unresolved sexual tension of the kitchen, but something deeper, more fragile. We were two people in a dark room, surrounded by a storm, surrounded by our own unspoken feelings. The silence stretched on, broken only by the rain and the thunder and the sound of our breathing. The proximity of him, even on the floor, was an electric hum. I was so aware of him it was a physical ache. After what felt like an hour, his voice came out of the darkness, a raw, quiet whisper that was almost stolen by the wind. "I can't sleep alone." The words hit me with the force of a physical confession, and I knew, with absolute certainty, he wasn't talking about the storm anymore. The breaking point had arrived. This was his surrender. This was his truth. My own truth was a painful lump in my throat. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. I heard a rustle of movement, and in the next flash of lightning, I saw he was on his feet. He moved to the side of the bed, a dark shape in the gloom. "This is stupid," he whispered, more to himself than to me. Then, the mattress dipped as he sat on the edge. He was so close I could feel the heat coming off his body. He hesitated for a moment. Then, with a sigh that sounded like he was giving up a long fight, he swung his legs up and slid under the covers, keeping a careful, respectful distance between us. But the space was not empty. It was filled with 1,000 unspoken questions. The air was thick with the scent of him, of rain and soap and something that was uniquely Julian. My body was a live wire, every nerve ending firing at once. We lay there, side by side in the dark, not touching, the storm raging around us. Then, slowly, deliberately, he shifted. He moved closer. I felt the brush of his leg against mine. And then he did something that stopped my heart. He slid his knee between mine, a warm, solid pressure that was both an anchor and a question. It was the most deliberate touch we had ever shared. A clear, undeniable invitation. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Instead, I shifted slightly, accepting the touch, answering the question. A shudder went through his body, a small, almost imperceptible tremor. He rolled onto his side to face me. I couldn't see his expression in the dark, but I could feel his gaze on me. I could feel his breath, warm and close. He lifted a hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of my jaw, his touch sending sparks across my skin. It was a touch full of reverence and hesitation and a deep, aching tenderness. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. And then he leaned in and took my mouth. The kiss was not what I had expected. It wasn't hungry or demanding. It was slow, searching, and utterly honest. It was a conversation without words, a confession of all the things we had been too afraid to say. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, then growing in confidence as I responded, as I opened to him, as I met his tentative exploration with my own. It tasted of rain and want and a profound, soul-deep relief. This was not the clumsy, frantic kiss of a movie scene. This was quiet. It was right. It was not rushed. It felt like coming home after a long, lonely journey. In the dark, with the storm raging outside, I let myself believe that this was real. The consummation of feeling, a first, honest kiss that promised the hope of a sunrise. I woke to the gentle gray light of dawn filtering through my window. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. For a moment, I was disoriented, my body humming with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. Then the memories of the night rushed back. The thunder, Julian's whispered confession, the slide of his knee between mine, the impossible softness of his lips. A shy smile touched my own lips. I rolled over, expecting to find him there, expecting to meet those warm brown eyes. The other side of the bed was empty. The warmth in my chest instantly turned to ice. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. The space where he had been was cool to the touch. He was gone. The smile fell from my face. Had I imagined it? Was it a dream, a feverish fantasy cooked up by my lonely, hopeful mind? The quiet of the apartment, once a comfort, was now a mocking, empty vessel. I pushed myself out of bed, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. My heart hammered a frantic, fearful rhythm against my ribs. He regretted it. Of course, he regretted it. He had woken up in the clear light of day and realized his mistake. I was the mistake. I crept out of my room, my stomach churning. I dreaded what I would find, or rather, what I wouldn't. I imagined his bags packed by the door, a hastily scribbled note on the counter. My mind, my greatest enemy, was already painting the worst-case scenario in vivid, painful detail. Then I smelled it. Coffee. I rounded the corner into the kitchen, and there he was. He was standing with his back to me, wearing the same gray sweatpants from the night before, a t-shirt stretched across his broad shoulders. He was at the counter, pouring hot water into 2 mugs. My mugs. The silence was heavy, thick with the awkwardness of the morning after. He hadn't run, but he wasn't looking at me, either. The relief I should have felt was immediately replaced by a fresh wave of anxiety. This was the moment he would say, "About last night," and crush the fragile hope that had taken root in my chest. I must have made a sound, because he tensed, his shoulders tightening. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his back a rigid wall between us. The seconds stretched into an eternity. I felt my throat close up. I should say something, break the terrible silence. but I was paralyzed by the fear of what he would say back. Finally, he let out a slow breath and turned around. He had 2 mugs in his hands. His face was unreadable, his eyes guarded. My heart sank. This was it. The rejection. He walked towards me, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of me, so close I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes. He held out one of the mugs. I took it numbly, my fingers brushing his. The warmth of the ceramic was a small, solid thing in my trembling hands. He met my eyes then, and the guarded expression on his face softened, replaced by something hesitant, something vulnerable. I didn't run away, he said, his voice quiet, a little rough. Just needed coffee to process. I stared at him, unable to speak, my mind trying to catch up. He didn't run away. He took a sip from his own mug, his eyes never leaving mine. Then he set it down on the counter beside him. He reached out, and, with a gentleness that made my chest ache, he took my free hand, lacing his fingers through mine. His hand was warm and strong around mine, a silent reassurance. The simple, deliberate touch was more powerful than any words. I don't regret it, he said, his voice low and steady, a clear, unwavering statement of fact. He squeezed my hand. Do you? The question was a lifeline. He was giving me an out, but he was also asking for reassurance. The confident, playful instigator was gone. In his place was a man who looked just as scared and hopeful as I felt. The ice around my heart cracked. I finally found my voice. No, I whispered, the word feeling impossibly small and yet holding the weight of my entire world. I don't regret it. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, relieved smile that reached his eyes and made them shine. It was like watching the sun come up. He lifted our joined hands and brushed his lips against my knuckles, a gesture so tender it almost broke me. Good, he murmured against my skin. That's really good to hear. The tension in the room didn't disappear, but it transformed. It was no longer the sharp, anxious wire of uncertainty. It was a warm, humming current of possibility. We stood there in the quiet kitchen, hands entwined, sipping our coffee, the unspoken promises of the night before solidifying into something real in the morning light. A few days later, my phone rang. The screen flashed with Sarah's name, and my stomach did a nervous flip. The outside world, testing our new reality. I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. Leo, how's my favorite brother? She chirped. Just calling to check in. How's the roommate situation going? Is Julian behaving himself? You haven't killed each other yet, have you? I froze. My eyes darted across the room to where Julian was sitting on the sofa, reading. He looked up, his brow furrowed in a silent question. How was the roommate situation going? The question, once so simple, was now impossibly complex. How do you explain that your roommate, the one who was supposed to be a temporary inconvenience, had completely and irrevocably rearranged the furniture of your soul? It's fine. I stammered, my cheeks growing hot. He's fine. Julian raised an eyebrow, a teasing smile playing on his lips. He clearly heard the panic in my voice. He set his book down and padded silently across the room toward me. Just fine, Sarah pressed, oblivious. Come on, give me some gossip. Is he leaving dirty socks everywhere? Are you bonding? I knew you two would get along. Julian came to a stop behind me. I felt the warmth of his body before he even touched me. He wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me back against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his lips close to my ear. My breath hitched. This was new. This easy, public-adjacent display of affection. Tell her, he whispered, his voice a low, playful rumble that vibrated through me, that her matchmaking skills are impeccable. A laugh escaped me, a real, unforced laugh. The tension in my shoulders eased. His arm tightened around me, a solid, comforting weight. He was right here, with me. We were in this together. What was that? Are you with him now? Sarah asked, her voice sharp with curiosity. I looked at Julian. He was smiling at me, his eyes full of warmth and a hint of mischief. He was giving me the choice, but he was also showing me he wasn't afraid. He wasn't hiding. I took a deep breath. Yeah, Sarah, I said, a smile in my own voice. He's here, and you were right. We're getting along just fine. The unspoken more than fine hung in the air, a truth I was no longer afraid to acknowledge, even if I wasn't ready to shout it from the rooftops. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Julian pressed a soft kiss to my temple, and I leaned back into him, feeling, for the first time, like I was part of a team. The weeks that followed were a quiet revelation. We were navigating the delicate, uncharted territory between roommates and something more. We didn't define it. We didn't have a big talk about what we were. We just were. We existed in a space of soft touches and shared silences. He started sleeping in my bed every night, not out of a fear of storms, but because it had become our place. The feel of his arm around me in the dark, the sound of his steady breathing next to me, became my new lullaby. My apartment, once a sterile sanctuary of solitude, was now a home. It was filled with his laughter, the scent of his cologne on my pillows, the sight of his green coffee mug next to mine on the drying rack. My gray world was slowly, beautifully, being saturated with color. I was painting again, but my work had changed. The brooding landscapes were replaced with studies of light, of the way the morning sun hit the rumpled sheets on our bed, of the vibrant orange of a sunrise. Then, the inevitable happened. The reason for our beginning threatened to become our end. Julian was on the phone one afternoon, his voice low and serious. I was in the studio, pretending to clean my brushes, but I was listening to every word. I heard him say things like, perfect location, and available on the first. My stomach twisted into a painful knot. His temporary housing situation was over. A new apartment was available for him. He hung up the phone. The silence that followed was deafening. This was it. The out. The end of our accidental fairy tale. He had a place to go. The pretense of him needing to be here was gone. He could walk away, and I would have no right to ask him to stay. The old Leo, the one who curated his life to avoid disruption, would have accepted this as the natural conclusion. He would have retreated back into his gray world, grateful for the brief splash of color, but resigned to its impermanence. But I wasn't that Leo anymore. Julian walked into the studio. He didn't look at me. He walked over to the window and stared out at the street below, his hands shoved into his pockets. I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He was wrestling with something. So, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Good news? He turned from the window to look at me. His face was a mask of conflict. Yeah, he said quietly. My friend found a place for me. It's a great deal. Close to work. That's great, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I was a terrible liar. He took a deep breath. I'm not going to take it. The words hung in the air between us, a shocking, beautiful declaration. My heart, which had been sinking into my shoes, soared. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to catch up. Why not? I asked, my voice a whisper. He finally met my eyes, and the conflict on his face was gone, replaced by a raw, unwavering sincerity. Because I don't want to, he said simply. He took a step closer to me. I like it here, another step. I like our mornings. I like watching you paint. I like arguing with you about what movie to watch. He was standing in front of me now, his hands coming up to cup my face, his thumbs stroking my cheeks. I like waking up next to you. Tears pricked my eyes. This was it. The conscious choice. This wasn't about convenience, or a burst pipe, or a thunderstorm. This was about him choosing to be here. With me. But this was always supposed to be temporary. I managed to say, the last vestiges of my old caution fighting a losing battle. Things change, he murmured, his gaze intense. I'm not going to take it, he repeated, his voice firm. Unless you want me to. He was giving me the power. He was laying his heart at my feet and asking me what I wanted to do with it. And in that moment, all the fear, all the anxiety, all the years of self-imposed isolation fell away. I knew what I wanted. For the first time, I wasn't a passive observer in my own life. I was an active participant. I leaned forward and closed the small space between us, pressing my lips to his. It was a kiss not of tentative discovery, but of firm, joyful confirmation. When I pulled back, I looked him straight in the eye. Don't go, I said. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. Okay, he breathed, resting his forehead against mine. Okay, the story doesn't end with a grand declaration or a dramatic flourish. It ends on a Sunday morning a few weeks later. The light is soft and hazy, filtering through the kitchen window. The air smells of coffee and sizzling bacon. I'm at the stove, flipping pancakes, a task that has become our weekend ritual. The quiet intimacy of the moment is a language we have both become fluent in. I feel him before I see him. The warmth of his body as he comes up behind me, the solid feel of his arms as they wrap around my waist. He rests his chin on my shoulder, his cheek rough against mine. He doesn't say anything. He just holds me, watching the pancakes bubble on the griddle. I lean my head back against his, my eyes drifting to the window over the sink. I can see our reflection in the glass, a slightly blurred, impressionistic image. Two men, standing in a sun-drenched kitchen, fitting together as if they were always meant to be in this frame. His arms around me, my hand resting on his. A simple, domestic tableau. It's in these quiet moments that I feel the magnitude of the change. I think about the man I was just a few months ago, living in a world of muted grays, an observer peering out from the safety of his bottle. Life was a series of still images I tried to capture, but never truly experienced. Julian hadn't just moved into my apartment. He had broken the glass. He didn't just bring color into my life. He showed me that I was capable of creating it myself, of feeling it, of living within it. He presses a soft kiss to the side of my neck, his lips warm against my skin. "They're going to burn, sunshine," he murmurs, his voice a low, happy rumble. I laugh and flip the pancakes. It's just a normal Sunday. It's just breakfast. But it feels like everything. The fear is gone, replaced by a quiet, steady certainty. The loneliness that was once my most constant companion has been evicted, its silence filled with the easy rhythm of another person's breathing, another person's heart beating close to mine. I am no longer painting lies about a life I don't understand. I am living. And as I look at our reflection in the window, at the man I love holding me in the kitchen that is now our kitchen, I realize, with a profound and peaceful clarity, that I've finally come home.